As you write unit and integration tests for various parts of your application, you might be wondering how much of your code is covered by tests and what are some scenarios that you have not tested. And that's where a code coverage tool comes into picture. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you how to use Jest to see how much of your code is covered by tests. So back to package.json. Here in the scripts property, we need to modify our test command. So we're going to add a new flag that is coverage. Save. Now back in the terminal, we need to stop this process and run an npm test one more time. So now we have a report of how much of our code is covered in tests. Now you might not like this table in the terminal window, but Jest also generates an HTML report of how much of our code is covered by tests. So let me show you where that is. So here's our vidlib folder. Now we have a new subfolder, coverage. In this folder, we have another folder. Let's have a look. And here we have an index.html file. Let's open this. All right, so here's the same report that you saw in the terminal window, but it's a little bit more pretty. So let me explain how this works. In this table, we have the list of our folders. So we have the root folder, middleware, models, and so on. In this column, you can see how much of the files in that folder are covered by test. For example, you can see majority of the files in the models folder are covered by test. Now, this does not mean that we have explicitly written tests for the files in this folder. It means that somewhere we have tests, and when we execute those tests, it will call the code inside of this folder. For example, in our models folder, look, 100% of the code in genre.js is tested. That doesn't mean that we have explicitly written tests for this file, but because we tested our genres routes, in some tests, we used the genre model, so all the code in this file has been exercised by one or more tests. So this is just a basic guideline. Now let's go back to all files. Now let's go to the middleware folder. Look at this auth module. Here in this table, we have a few parameters. We have statements, branches or execution paths, functions, and lines. So in our auth module, we have a total of 11 statements, and 100% of those are covered by tests. We have 2 branches or 2 execution paths, and again, 100% of them are covered by test. Let's have a quick look at these execution paths. So here's our auth module. As you saw earlier, this is one execution path, and here we have another execution path. Now, more accurately, here we have 3 execution paths because it's possible that a token is valid or invalid. But our code coverage tool determines the branches or execution paths based on the return statements. Okay? Now back to this table, we also have functions. So in our auth module, we have only one function, and that function is tested. And finally, we have the number of lines of code. And again, what you see here is not exactly what you see in your code editor, because in this module, we have 16 lines of code, and this is based on how we have formatted our code. But the code coverage tool sees this differently. It will reformat the code. So the number of lines of code we have here is different from what we see in this table. So this table tells us what areas of the code we need to focus more on. For example, you can see our admin module is really low on testing. So we need to focus more on this module. Now let me show you something really interesting. Let's go back to all files. Go to the routes folder. So here's our genres module. You can see we have tested over 60% of the code in this module. Now let's click on the file name. You can see the code in this module, and you can see the areas that are not covered by test highlighted in red. For example, look at this route handler. Let me zoom in so you can see more clearly. So earlier, we wrote tests to get a single genre. However, this line of this function is not covered by any tests. Let's see why. So here are the 2 tests that we wrote for this endpoint. look at the second test case. It should return 404 if invalid ID is passed. So we passed 1 as an invalid ID, and with our current implementation, this validate object ID middleware will kick in and return a 404 error. However, if we pass a valid object ID, there is no test to assert that we get a 404 error. So we can come back here, duplicate this test, and rename it. So instead of saying invalid ID, we can say if no genre with the given ID exists. And then instead of sending 1, we can send a valid object ID. So let's create that here, mongoose.types.object ID. And then we pass that here. Now save. Back in the terminal, just reruns our test and regenerates the coverage report every time. So back to this page, if we refresh now, this red highlight will be gone. There you go. So use the code coverage tool that comes with Jest to see what areas of your code need more testing. Now, one more thing before we finish this lecture. I've put this project in the Git repository. Now that I enabled coverage in Jest, look, all these files are going to be checked into the repository. We want to exclude this coverage folder because there is really no point in checking in all these files in our repository. These can easily be generated every time we run our tests. So let's go to our git ignore file. Here we add the coverage folder, so it will be excluded from Git. Now you can see all those changes are gone.